when Europe trembled before a rising storm, when armies fell and flags changed overnight, one voice refused to surrender. Winston Churchill was not the biggest army or the richest empire. He was a man, a voice, and a will. And that will became the one thing Adolf Hitler could not crush. This is the story of Winston Churchill, Hitler's worst nightmare. He was born in 1874 into privilege, in a grand house where ambition ran in the blood. His father was Lord Randolph Churchill, a fiery politician, and his mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American socialite. From the start, Winston's world was one of politics and power, but also distance. His parents were often absent, and young Winston sought affection in adventure and achievement. He once said, "I was not a very happy little boy," but he learned something crucial. If the world ignored you, you made it listen. At Sandhurst Military Academy, Churchill was not top of his class, but he was restless, curious, and daring. As a young officer, he chased action like others chased comfort. The cavalry charge at Omdurman, the Boer War, the trenches of the Great War. He turned those battles into stories, and those stories into fame. Even before he was 30, the British public knew his name. He entered politics not to follow, but to lead. Churchill's early career was a parade of victories and disasters. He changed parties twice, made enemies easily, and often seemed too loud for the room. He was bold, argumentative, and absolutely sure of his own judgment. When the First World War erupted, he became First Lord of the Admiralty, the man overseeing Britain's navy. Then came Gallipoli, a campaign meant to break the deadlock and strike through Turkey. It failed disastrously, costing thousands of lives. Churchill was blamed and cast out. He knew the sting of failure. You would not forget it. Years later, he called that period his wilderness years. He spent them writing, painting, and warning. While others dreamed of peace, Churchill saw something darker. Across the Channel, a former corporal named Adolf Hitler was transforming Germany into a war machine. Churchill, alone among many, spoke out. He warned that appeasement was a mirage, and that weakness would only feed the beast. Few listened. He became a political relic, mocked as a man obsessed with ghosts of war. Then, the ghosts became real. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain declared war. The age of illusions was over. Churchill returned to the Admiralty, the post he had once lost. The telegram went out. Winston is back. When disaster struck again, Norway, France, Dunkirk, Britain needed not a diplomat, but a fighter. In May 1940, King George VI asked Winston Churchill to form a government. The empire's fate would rest on the shoulders of the man it had once cast aside. Churchill understood the magnitude of the moment. France was collapsing, Europe was falling, and Hitler's army seemed unstoppable. Yet he stood in Parliament and promised only blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He offered not comfort, but courage. His voice thundered through the radio. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." It was more than rhetoric. It was defiance turned into music. The words gave Britain its spine. Hitler expected Britain to make peace. Many in his inner circle believed the island would fall within weeks. But Churchill saw the war as a moral crusade. He declared that even if Britain stood alone, she would stand to the end. And for a time, she did stand alone against a continent enslaved. Then came the Blitz, night after night. German bombers poured destruction on London, Coventry, Liverpool, and countless towns. Cities burned, families huddled in shelters, the sky glowed red. Churchill visited the ruins, walking among the people, his cigar glowing in the dark. He told them, "We can take it." They believed him. In those long nights, Hitler tried to break Britain's spirit, but each bomb seemed to harden it. The Royal Air Force fought the Luftwaffe in the skies over southern England. Churchill watched the battles unfold from bunkers and rooftops. When victory came, he praised those pilots with words that still echo through history. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Those few had kept the island alive. Hitler's plan to invade Britain was postponed, then abandoned. It was his first great defeat, not on a battlefield, but in the realm of endurance. The British refused to kneel. Churchill had turned an entire nation into a fortress of the mind. Beyond the air war, Churchill knew Britain's survival depended on allies. He reached out to President Franklin Roosevelt, sending message after message across the Atlantic. Slowly, he persuaded the American leader that Britain was the front line of freedom. In 1941, the Lend-Lease Act sent food, ships, and weapons across the ocean. Later, when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought America fully into the war, Churchill breathed easy. "We have won the war," he said quietly that night. "For now, we have allies." But even alliances required balance. Churchill had to manage not only Roosevelt, but also Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader he distrusted but needed. The three formed what Churchill called the Grand Alliance. They met in conferences from Tehran to Yalta, shaping strategies and arguing over post-war plans. Churchill often found himself squeezed between the two giants, fighting not just the Axis powers, but also to preserve Britain's place in the world. Under his leadership, British forces fought from North Africa to Italy, from Burma to Normandy. The tide of war turned. Hitler's armies were pushed back on every front, yet Churchill remained restless, fearing both defeat and the peace that would follow. He knew that victory would not erase the cost: the bombed cities, the ration lines, the empty chairs at dinner tables. Still, his speeches continued to lift spirits. "This is not the end," he told Parliament after a major victory. "It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." Each phrase was a rallying cry. His mastery of language became a weapon as sharp as any sword. But Churchill was not without flaws. His confidence sometimes slid into arrogance. He believed deeply in the British Empire and resisted independence movements. His handling of the Bengal famine in 1943 remains one of the most painful chapters of his record, a tragedy that cost millions of lives. To many, he was the savior of democracy. To others, a symbol of empire's dark side. Both can be true. Greatness and controversy often share the same stage. As 1940 approached, Hitler's empire crumbled. Allied troops entered Germany. Concentration camps were uncovered, and the world saw the depths of Nazi brutality. When victory in Europe was declared, Britain erupted in joy. Churchill stood before the cheering crowd, his two fingers raised in the V for victory sign that had become his emblem. He was 70 years old, exhausted, triumphant, and mortal. Yet history has its ironies. Only weeks after victory, Britain went to the polls, and Churchill lost. The man who had led his country through its darkest hour was voted out. The people wanted change, a new society, a welfare state, a future built not on war but on peace. Churchill accepted the verdict with grace, saying simply, "They have a right to vote for whom they wish. That is democracy." He returned to writing, painting, and speaking. In the years that followed, he warned again, this time about a new danger: the rise of the Iron Curtain dividing Europe. He urged the West to remain vigilant, to stand united. The Cold War was beginning, and once again, Churchill saw it coming before most. In 1951, he became Prime Minister again, older but undimmed. His second term was quieter, shaped by the realities of a changing world and declining empire. He retired in 1955, and when he passed away a decade later, the world paused. Leaders and soldiers, kings and citizens lined the streets of London to bid farewell to the man who had refused to bow. His funeral was broadcast across the globe, a farewell not just to a statesman, but to an era of iron will and unyielding courage. So what made Churchill Hitler's nightmare? It was not only his words or his strategy. It was his understanding of fear. He knew that tyranny thrives on despair, and he refused to give it room. Every decision, every broadcast, every gesture was aimed at one goal: to keep the flame alive until help arrived. Hitler could conquer land, but he could not conquer that flame. Churchill once said, "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." Those words defined him. Through defeats, through criticism, through isolation, he continued. And that persistence changed history. Today, decades after the guns fell silent, his image still stands. The bulldog, the cigar, the voice that thundered across the airwaves. Some see him as the savior of freedom, others as a relic of empire. But even his critics admit this. When humanity stood on the edge of darkness, he refused to step back. If Hitler's empire was built on fear, Churchill's defense was built on defiance. One man's voice against a tide of terror. One nation's stand against the storm. And when the storm passed, it was Churchill's voice, rough, defiant, unbroken, that still echoed across the world. Winston Churchill, the man who turned words into weapons, resolve into resistance, and an island into an idea. Hitler's worst nightmare was not an army, not a bomb, not even an empire. It was a man who simply would not surrender. Because sometimes, the strongest weapon in history is not a gun or a tank. It is conviction. And in the long war between fear and freedom, that conviction became the light that never went out.